Hi there. How are you all doing? Good? Aren't these presentations amazing? Dr. Kim, that was beautiful about Bhutan. I just learned so much, and it was just so powerful to think about that. Now, are these ideas about happiness, is it new for you to be thinking about these things, or is this stuff you talk about at school all the time? Is it pretty new? No? Have you heard about these things before? How many people have heard about this all the time before in high school? Raise your hand. Okay, so just about 4 of you, 5 of you. Okay, so what we're going to talk about now is actually about the adolescent experience. And adolescence can be defined as beginning somewhere around 11, 12, 13 years of age and going upward, not ending at 19, but actually going on to the mid-20s. So are any of you between, let's say, 12 and 24 in the room? Raise your hand. Okay, so these ideas may be relevant for you. And I'm proud to say that my son, Alex, is actually here. He's now 25. But when he was going through his adolescence with his sister, who's now 20, it was really challenging to understand what was going on. And so I ended up writing a book called Brainstorm for adolescents to read that helps you dive into the new understanding of what the adolescent period is all about. Because as a parent, I was told all sorts of things that turned out to be completely wrong. And you as an adolescent are probably being told these same things. And so in the book, it kind of points out what the myths are and then gives you as an adolescent tools for what to do differently. So part of what we're going to talk about is to relate the adolescent experience to the topic of this whole week in San Francisco, which is about compassion. And you've been hearing something really fascinating, which is there's something about this process of compassion which is defined as feeling another person's feelings, number one. Number two, thinking about if that person is suffering, what you might do to help them, number two. And then number three, acting on those feelings you have and the thoughts you have to actually do something to help reduce another person's suffering. That's one way that people like Paul Gilbert, who's a scientist just in the building next door now, would define compassion. Feeling another person's feelings, thinking about what their suffering's about and what you might do, and then doing something about it. So you heard that compassion, defined that way, has to do with something called inner transformation. And when you think about that, why would doing something with the inside of you have anything to do with what you do with other people? That's what we're going to address. And in looking at that, what comes up is this fundamental way of thinking about what it means to be kind and compassionate. And I feel very, very honored because we have a wonderful organization called Random Acts of Kindness, which actually started here in Northern California, now is an international process. And they approached me and said, you know, we think there's something about the adolescent period that has to do with random acts of kindness. And I said, what is it? They said, well, let's do a project together. And you are going to be the first people outside of our organization to ever see this video. The adolescent period is absolutely amazing. People often give it a negative approach, saying, oh, it's a time where adolescents are going to lose their mind, or they're just immature, or raging hormones drive them crazy. These are all not only wrong, but they're myths that mislead us and actually disempower us. Whether we're adults or adolescents, they actually give us the wrong message and they make it so there's nothing we can do. So what is actually the truth? The truth is that instead of raging hormones, what's happening is we have remodeling in the brain. In ways we never could have predicted, we now understand 2 big things are happening in the brain. Things you as an adult can support adolescents in developing well, and if you're an adolescent, you actually can use this to help your brain grow in an optimal way. What are those 2 things? The brain is pruning itself. So imagine that in childhood, you're growing like a tree and establishing all these branches and all these leaves are growing. In the brain, that means connections among the basic cell, the neuron, called synapses, are being established, and you're soaking in the knowledge of the world, and that's beautiful. The tree is just growing, growing, growing.
But then what happens, that surprised everyone, is the brain begins to prune itself. You start carving away some of those leaves, some of the smaller branches, even some of the larger branches. And the reason for the pruning is to specialize the brain. While the child is developing in ways that are really generalized, learning everything they can about everything they can, an adolescent is going to begin to find their passion, to actually find things they like, things they really love doing, and to drive their development in that way. So pruning is actually a use it or lose it principle underneath it. That if you don't use something, you're gonna lose it. So if you like sports or like dancing or like music, do those things so you continue to establish those circuits. The second thing that happens in the remodeling adolescent brain is myelin formation. Myelin is a healthy sheath that allows connected neurons to communicate with each other in a much more effective way. How? It's 100 times faster, the signal that's sent down a neuron to communicate with another neuron, 100 times faster, and after it fires off, it's 30 times shorter the resting period that happens. 30 times 100 is 3,000, so when you've put down myelin, you've made your neurons communicate 3,000 times more effectively. That's a great thing. Now the great thing too is that you as an adolescent can actually use the focus of your attention to be aware of your emotions, aware of other people, to be engaging in activities, to be doing things with your thoughts that actually reinforce the parts of your brain you want to hold on to. So the good news about the remodeling story is that a field called neuroplasticity, how the brain responds to experience, shows us that what you do with your mind can change the activity and therefore the structure of your brain. So if you then come up with the statement that the ultimate goal of brain remodeling is to make an integrated brain, to differentiate areas, that's the pruning, and myelinate them, that's the linkage. When you increase differentiation and linkage, you make the brain more integrated. And an integrated brain is the pathway toward well-being. And you can do mind-sight exercises. These are exercises that increase insight, empathy, and integration. And if you do them as an adolescent, and you can also do them as an adult, you'll actually increase the integration of your brain as your brain is growing, not just during adolescence, but throughout the lifespan. And what's the outcome of integration? When integration is made visible, it's kindness and compassion. And so what we see through adolescent development is that our relationships become built on connections that are deep and filled with honoring each other's vulnerability, that's kindness, and supporting connections that are compassionate, filled with a sense of caring about other people and wanting to help them. This is the kind of world we can build as we move through life and support each other in our development.
But basically, what we're going to do is address the fundamental question, why do we need to have inner work to actually create a happier life? What is that about? You're going to hear about this more later today, but let me just say this. It's a brief little story. When I was a little bit older than you, and I finished high school, well, I didn't finish high school, I left high school, and it was during the war, so I went off to college early, the Vietnam War. I went off to college early, that's why I didn't finish school, but went to college, and when I went to medical school, a strange thing happened where many of the professors that I saw treating patients treated the patients as if they were objects, just physical collections of chemicals. And I had studied biochemistry, so I knew a lot about biochemistry. So I knew what they were saying was accurate, but it was really wrong what they were doing. They would take a person who, let's say, had a disease where they were dying and just say, you know, your chemical lab tests say you're dying, I'm sorry, goodbye. Now, why would that be a problem? Any ideas? Because yes, you're dying, sorry, nothing can do about it. I would pull on the lab coat of my professor and say, don't you want to talk to that person about that person's feelings? And these professors of mine, you know what they said? Why would I do that? I can't do anything with the disease, so there's nothing more for me to do. How many of you feel inside of you that there's something wrong about that? Raise your hand. Well, I felt that way too, so I ended up dropping out of medical school, and I actually took a train across Canada and then a bus down here to San Francisco. And I remember I was still an adolescent thinking, there's something really wrong. So the basic thing I want to tell you about that story, and I went back to medical school, I made up a word called mindsight. You saw it on this video. Mindsight means seeing the inner life of one's own world, your feelings and thoughts, your hopes and your dreams. And it means seeing the inner mind, which is the subjective experience of another person. Integration is the third aspect of mindsight, which means we honor the differences between ourselves and other people, and we then link with them with compassionate and kind action. So mindsight is insight into yourself, empathy for other people's inner lives, and integration, meaning honoring those differences and promoting linkages. Now, what's really amazing is a study came out just recently that showed physicians who don't speak from a mindsight kind of point of view, they don't identify the inner mental state, like the feelings of a patient, have patients who don't do as well as patients who see a compassionate and empathic person as a physician. So literally, your body doesn't do so well when you're around people who are not empathic. So what I'd like to do is ask you to think about this. Look at me up here and just watch what I'm doing. Watch what I'm doing. Okay. And now I'm going to ask Alex, can you send me that bottle over here? And now watch when I do a very similar action, only this time with this. See how you feel differently. Okay. How many of you felt differently when I had a bottle in my hand? Raise your hand. Okay, how did it feel differently? Just throw out some words. When I had the bottle in my hand, yes. So my action had a purpose, exactly. So your mind can make sense of it, exactly. When we see that there's a purpose or an intention behind an action, you actually can feel it differently inside of you. When we interact with other people, like when you saw Dr. Kim talk about the relationships in Bhutan, where you saw people interacting with a sense of community trust, what that phrase means, community trust, is you can look at someone who's a member of your community and you recognize that inside of them, they have your goodwill with their intentions. That's a form of mindsight where you're actually seeing the mental state of another person and you're feeling the trust in that. In this example of the bottle, it's the most simple example I can give you, which is you can see someone as a physical object and just have object sight, or you can use mind sight. So the reason we need to go inward to actually lead to a more compassionate world is this. The pathway for a doctor, let's say, to really understand that a patient who has a serious illness has a feeling requires that that doctor know their own inner mind, know their own feelings. And it begins actually by sensing the emotional expressions that Dr. Ekman talked about in the tone of voice and in the face, as well as being able to take in what you sense is the emotional world of the other. So the first step is you feel what's going on inside of yourself. The second step is you take those feelings in your own body and you imagine what's going on in someone else. That's called insight, the first part. The second part is empathy. And then finally, in terms of trust, when you say, whatever is going on in this other person, I honor that's your experience. I may not have the same experience as you, but I really want to know what you're feeling. So for that doctor that was my professor, when I came back to school with the word mindsight in mind, I would see these professionals, these professors, and I would tell them that they're missing a whole level of reality. which is the mind is real. And the reason we need to go inward for inner transformation that Dr. Kim was talking about is as we go out in the world, there are a lot of really, really difficult things. The world is filled with a lot of suffering. And if we only treat people as objects, we'll actually feel empty inside. The first divide Dr. Kim talked about, we'll get disconnected from ourselves. But if we get connected to ourselves, the second divide, the social divide, is that we need to have the inner resilience, which we can develop through these trainings, like mindfulness training, to actually feel another person's suffering, and then take it to the third step, which is integration, where we sense not only other people, but even our relationship with the planet is incredibly important. So instead of withdrawing, which my professors did, and just say, there's nothing I can do, I'm not going to take any action here and talk about your feelings, we need to give all of us those 3 steps. Get connected with ourselves for inner awareness, so we can actually be aware of another person's inner world, and then actually realize that we are part of an interconnected whole. And the last thing I'll say, because I know my time is up, is this final thing, and this is how I end the book, the Brainstorm book. We are raised in American culture, and all of you are raised by your families and your teachers and the media to think that the self just lives in your body. How many of you think that your self is in the body you're in here? Only. Raise your hand. Oh, okay, so only a couple. That's great. Because the fact is the self is not only a me, it's also a we. It's also connected to everyone in this room, and ways that you'll find to become more compassionate, to become kinder in the world. So what I say at the end of the book is, it isn't just a we even. It's not getting rid of a me, but how do you put me and we together into one self that's both internal and interconnected? What would you call that? If you had to try to remember it with a single word, what would you call if you had a me, that's my internal life of this body, but also a we of connected to other people and even the whole planet of living beings? What would you call it? You two know? We. You'd call it we. M-W-E. So that's the final thing I'll say, is that the way to be more compassionate in the world is realize that the world is actually a part of ourselves. And if we can take on the identity as a we, then I think together we can make this a kinder and more compassionate world for all of us. Thank you very much.